What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and today I'm back with a video. This time once again, we're going to be doing a player comparison video. And for this comparison, we're going to look at two of the best point guards of all time, that being Chris Paul, as well as John Stockton. And for this video, I'm going to be looking at both these players at their absolute peak, as well as their prime. And for me, that is a 10-year period. And within that time, we'll look at their stats, the overall context of those players, their teammate help, and their overall impact on winning. And at the end of the video, I'll give my opinion on who was the better overall point guard in their absolute prime. So first up, we have John Stockton, one of the more underrated players in NBA history. And in Stockton's career, he played 19 seasons in the NBA with one franchise, that being the Utah Jazz. His absolute prime was in 1988 to 1997. And during that time period, Stockton was a 9-time All-Star, 10-time All-NBA player, 10-time assist leader, 2-time steals leader, played all 82 games 9 times, and was a 5-time All-Defensive player. Also during this time period, the Jazz made their first ever finals in 1997. So from an accolade standpoint, Stockton had a very accomplished 10-year run. When looking at his prime stats in the playoffs, once again he was very impressive, averaging 15.6 points per game, 11.8 assists, 3.5 boards, 2.0 steals on 57, 32, and 83 splits. And also during this time period, he led the playoffs in assists 8 different seasons. And also one thing I have to note is how good Stockton was in elimination games. During that 10-year period in the playoffs, he averaged 17.4 points per game, 12.0 assists, and 3.9 boards when his team was facing elimination. And more times than not, he came through with big-time clutch plays as well as big-time clutch shots. And we're looking at his playoff resume, his best deep playoff run was in 1997. During this playoff run, he averaged 16 points per game, nearly 10 assists, 3.9 boards, 1.7 steals, on 57, 38, and 85 splits, while leading the playoffs in assists as well as steals. And like I said before with Stockton in the big-time moments, he more times than not came through and showed up in the big-time games. And probably the most iconic game of his career was in the Western Conference Finals in Game 6 in Houston. In this game, Stockton had 25 points, 13 assists, and 2 boards on 53% shooting. And at the end of the game, he had the game-winning three-pointer to send Utah to the finals. So when it came to John Stockton in 1987, he was extremely clutch and great in the fourth quarters. And the stats 100% back this up. When it came to fourth quarter scoring, he ranked 7th on 51, 27, and 90 splits. When it came to clutch time scoring, the last 5 minutes of game within 5 points, he was 2nd at 4 points per game on insane 76, 57, and 60 splits. Now also when looking at a prime John Stockton in the playoffs, his impact was definitely felt. When it came to the advanced stat categories like win shares, offensive win shares, box plus minus, etc., he was his team's leader more times than not, once again showing his impact was immense on those great Jazz teams. And also looking at their records during this time period, Utah won 60 plus games twice and 55 games 3 separate years. So John Stockton during this period, he wasn't the Jazz's best player, but you could argue from a basketball standpoint, he might have been their most valuable weapon. So that right there was the overall summary of a prime John Stockton from 1988 to 1997. And next up we have Chris Paul, whose 10-year prime was 2008 to 2017. And during this time period, CP3 was a 9-time All-Star, an 8-time All-NBA player, 4-time assist leader, 6-time steals leader, nearly an MVP, and an 8-time All-Defensive player. And during this 10-year period, he played 4 years in New Orleans and 6 years with the LA Clippers. And when it comes to Chris Paul's overall resume, it's definitely impressive, and looking at his playoff stats, they're equally as impressive, as he averaged 21.4 points per game, 9.4 assists, 4.7 boards, 2.2 steals, on 58, 38, and 85 splits. And during that 10-year run, he was a 3-time assist leader and a 2-time steals leader. But unfortunately for Chris Paul during that 10-year run, not once would he make the Western Conference Finals, let alone the NBA Finals like John Stockton. Now with CP3 never making the Western Conference Finals, most of his playoff runs were pretty short, but his most impressive playoff run was actually his first playoff appearance in 2008. During this run, he averaged 24.1 points per game, 11.3 assists, 4.9 boards, 2.3 steals, on 56, 24, and 79 splits, while leading the playoffs in PER, assists, steals, box plus minus, as well as offensive win shares. And looking at the 08 playoff run more in depth, Chris Paul had 2 legendary series. Versus Dallas, he averaged 25 and 12 with 5.6 boards on 50% shooting. That scoring average is the third highest in a series of his entire career, and assist average is the highest of his career till this day. For San Antonio, he averaged 24 and 11 with 4.4 boards on once again 50% shooting. That 23.7 average is 7th in Chris Paul's career, and that assist average ranked 4th. So in the 08 playoff run, Chris Paul's Hornets didn't have major success, but from an individual standpoint, he had the best playoff run of his career for a prime Chris Paul. And lastly, when talking about a prime Chris Paul and his overall impact, it's definitely pretty impressive how much he improves a team when he gets there, as well as when he leaves, how hard they fall off. When Chris Paul was drafted to the Hornets, he improved them by 20 plus wins. When he was traded from them in 2011, they lost 20 more games without him. The LA Clippers in 2011, before Chris Paul got there, only won 32 games. In Chris Paul's first year with the Clippers, they were on a 50-win pace in a lockout-shortened season. So in summary, Chris Paul's impact on the basketball court is up there with the best point guards of all time when it comes to a prime CP3. Now, so far in this video, we've seen a prime CP3 as well as a prime John Stockton. Now for the best part of this video, let's compare the two and see who was better at their absolute prime. And stats-wise in the playoffs for this comparison, it's pretty lopsided in Chris Paul's favor, as he averages more points, more boards, more steals, less turnovers, has a better true shooting percentage, better three-point percentage, as well as a better free throw percentage. So off the raw stat numbers, Chris Paul in the playoffs was the better overall player than a prime John Stockton. And if you look to the advanced stat category, Chris Paul once again has a big advantage on John Stockton, having a higher PER, higher win share average, more offensive win shares, a higher box plus minus, offensive box plus minus, as well as defensive box plus minus. So in terms of overall stats, a prime Chris Paul has a pretty major edge on a prime John Stockton. And stats, as you guys know, they are pretty good and get some great insight, but they aren't everything when talking about basketball players. If you look at these two guys as individuals, I think it's much closer. When it comes to scoring the basketball, Chris Paul, I think has the edge on Stockton, as CP3 was asked to score more and had more of a scorer's mindset. John Stockton, he was the better passer and the better overall team player, as during his time period point guards had pretty big constraints when it came to scoring the basketball as well as shooting threes. When it comes to being highly efficient players, both these guys had very high basketball IQs and took very efficient shots. But I think Chris Paul, from an overall standards, in large part due to his era, was the more efficient player looking at their all-around game. The same thing can be said when it comes to team value, as Chris Paul didn't have as much teammate help or team success, but in terms of an overall value standpoint, Chris Paul, his impact on his teams was greater than John Stockton. And keep in mind, Stockton played 10 straight years with Karl Malone in his prime. Chris Paul, for the most part, didn't have as much help. He had Blake Griffin, who was great before injuries, he had DeAndre Jordan, who was an all-right all-star, and he had David West, who was a solid offensive option. Now when it comes to clutch time play, John Stockton, in this category, I think he beats out Chris Paul pretty handily, as CP3 in his prime had some pretty big playoff chokes and lost some series that he definitely should have won. The two that stand out in my mind are the 2014 choke job versus the Thunder, and in 2015, blowing a 3-1 lead to the Houston Rockets. So from an overall legacy standpoint, I think John Stockton during his time period actually accomplished a lot more than Chris Paul from a team standpoint. When it comes to accolades also, I think he was more accomplished than a prime Chris Paul. But when it comes to who was the better overall basketball player, I would actually lean in Chris Paul's favor. It's not just the stats, the advanced numbers, the overall value metrics. It also has to do with the fact that John Stockton in his prime was outplayed multiple times by other point guards he was considered better than. In 1990, he was outplayed by Kevin Johnson and beaten at Series 3-2. In 91 as well as 92, he was outplayed by Terry Porter. In 96, he was outplayed in the first round by Rod Strickland. In the Western Conference Finals, outplayed by Gary Payton. And in 97, he was outplayed by Nick Van Exel. I mean, for the most part, those players are very good to very great players, all-star caliber, but for John Stockton, the quote-unquote best point guard of the 90s, it's pretty damn he got outplayed by those point guards in all those series. And yes, Chris Paul in his career, he was also outplayed by some other great point guards. In 2009, Chauncey Billups outplayed him, 2012, Tony Parker did, 2014, Steph Curry, and 2014, once again, Russell Westbrook. But when looking at Chris Paul's list, it's not as damning as John Stockton's, as CP3 for the most part was outplayed by some of the greatest point guards of his era as well as all time. So in conclusion, we're looking at these two players, a prime Chris Paul and a prime John Stockton. When it came to scoring, Chris Paul has the edge, When it comes to passing and basketball IQ, John Stockton has the edge. When it comes to efficiency as well as value, I give the edge to Chris Paul. When it comes to clutch play as well as legacy, I give it to John Stockton. And when it comes to defensive impact, I give that to Chris Paul. So in summary, Chris Paul in his prime, he was marginally better than John Stockton, but John Stockton in his time was a greater overall player. So with that being said, that is my final verdict on a prime Chris Paul versus a prime John Stockton. As always, let me know your guys' thoughts. Who you think was better? Did I get this right? Did I get it wrong? Let me know in the comments. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you guys next time.